I'm back with Leonydus Johnson. We're talking about his book, Raising Victims, The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. I just went on Amazon today to make sure it's up there for order. It sure is, so check it out. It's a really good book. I've read it. In fact, Leonydus, I was happy to have a little blurb that I sent you that appears somewhere in the book, maybe in the back. Let's come back to what we were talking about. Do you think that the fake racial incidents that we have seen, and by this I'm thinking of, let's use Jussie Smollett as a kind of metaphor for all the fake racial incidents. There have been a lot of them on campus, a lot of them in society. It's almost like people are, the reason they do that is for the reason you said. They feel the system is racist, but it seems to be kind of invisibly so. So we need to orchestrate these incidents that will provide a kind of dramatic confirmation of what we, the activists, know to be true. Do you think that's the actual motive? Because otherwise it just seems pathological why somebody would fake. I think I saw something where, when before has a black guy put a noose around his own neck? Jussie Smollett sort of is the first guy to do that.
Yeah, you wonder how often those cases were actually happening during the civil rights movement and during actual oppression. How often people were faking their own oppression. But yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into, even if they're not consciously doing that, I think that sort of justification is apparent because, if you look around, if people are telling you that you're oppressed and you feel internally that you're oppressed, but you look around and you don't see any evidence of that, any direct evidence that you're actually oppressed or that your life is terrible and people aren't really treating you that way, then you may start subconsciously looking for justification for that. And, there's all kinds of cases of people doing that. Like there was a girl, and I forget which university it was, but she set her dorm room on fire. It said that it was white supremacists or racist people on campus who did it in order to justify her complaints of racism. And so these kind of cases are pretty common. But one of the allegories I always bring up, Dinesh, is that it comes from an Australian philosopher named Ken Minogue. And he talks about St. George and retirement syndrome. And St. George was this prolific dragon slayer, and he slayed all the dragons in the land. He was this big celebrity. He was prolific. All the villagers loved him. His entire identity was in slaying dragons. So he goes into retirement after all the dragons are slain, and he suddenly starts to have this identity crisis. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't have any meaning to his life or any purpose. But then he looks outside and he suddenly sees a dragon. He's saved, right? He runs out and he slays the dragon, and now he's fulfilled. And he looks around and he sees dragons everywhere now. There's dragons that bark. There's dragons that quack. There's dragons that claim to be villagers, right? And so he slays them all. And then eventually he's seen swinging his sword at thin air even and proclaiming it to be the fiercest dragon of them all. And I find that allegory to be very potent because that's what we're seeing with the races, because people have so deeply rooted their identity in racial oppression and fighting racial oppression. And so if there's no evidence of that, their only option that they really have is to come to create it, to create this contrived version of oppression and pretend that they're slaying dragons, even though there are no dragons present. And I think that's exactly what's happening with critical race theory.
It seems like another reason it's happening, to add to this very interesting, analogy, is this, and that is that if you're St. George and you're out of dragons, but now you want there to be dragons, and you go out looking for dragons, and let's say you see imaginary dragons, right? Normally, the other people in society would go, St. George, you're kind of out of your mind. There are no dragons. We don't see them. It's a windmill. That's Sancho, that's Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, right? But imagine if all the people in society go, yes, George, you're absolutely right. There is indeed an imaginary dragon, and it's real. So what I'm getting at is when these people fake these racial incidents, they get social reinforcement for it. The academic authorities are on board. The faculty members organize a rally. Suddenly this person becomes a celebrity. So St. George thinks, I'm fighting dragons all over again. Even though there seem to be no dragon carcasses, I'm still slaying dragons.
Right. There's a lot of positive reinforcement and not a whole lot of negative reinforcement. That's absolutely correct. And, the other aspect to it, I think, is that there's this idea that if you can't see the dragons, it's because you're not a dragon slayer, right? Like only the dragon slayers can see the dragon. And so if you can't see them, then you just need to be an ally. You just need to accept that the dragons are there, even though they're invisible. And you just need to become an ally and recognize how best you can help the dragon slayers and just capitulate and bow down to the ideology. So there's that aspect too, where people feel like, well, because I'm not a dragon slayer, because I'm white for our case, then I can't comment on racial issues because I don't know what it's like to be black. I don't know what it's like to be oppressed. So therefore, I can't make a judgment. I don't see the racism, but I have to judge your truth. I have to accept your truth and your lived experience, and I'll go slay these dragons with you. And I think there's a lot of that in our society as well.
Now, do you think, let's talk about how we blow the whistle on all this. I mean, in the story of the little boy who shouted that the emperor has no clothes, we don't have any follow-up to that story, right? We don't know if by shouting that, everybody was like, you know what, this kid is right. Now you're writing a book to sort of blow the whistle on all this. But right. If somebody is in the throes of this mode of thinking that you've just described, is a book like this going to get through to them? What is your sort of strategy in trying? Who are you writing for? And what is your strategy of reaching them?
I'm writing for the people who are on the fence. The people who aren't sure, who don't really understand what critical race theory is. They may sense that there's a problem, but they're not really sure how to approach it. Or maybe they feel isolated and they're not really sure how to push back against it. The whole point of the book is to explain what critical race theory is, where it comes from, how it's disguising itself in our society as like anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion, social, emotional learning, all of these different ideas that infiltrate our institutions that push critical race theory ideology. And then just breaking apart the different arguments and the different illogic of the arguments. And showing people how, like, okay, so when people say diversity, that's not what they mean. They don't mean actual natural occurring diversity. They mean capitulating to progressive ideology. When people say equity, they don't mean equality. They mean equality of outcomes, which requires force and intentional inequality. When people say inclusion, they don't mean inclusiveness of all ideological thought. They mean only progressivism. So like all of these ideas and breaking them apart so that people understand the arguments and they understand the manipulation. Because Dinesh, like, it's so easy. Like, I'll use Black Lives Matter for example. Like, people are so easily manipulated by language that, all you have to do is accuse them of racism, and then they'll capitulate because they don't want to be considered racist. So if you say, like, well, this is Black Lives Matter, and then they push all the radical, anti-nuclear family, all white people are racist, we need to give reparations, all these radical ideas underneath of it. And if you reject that and they say, oh, but you don't think Black Lives Matter, then people will back off. And they say, well, of course I believe Black Lives Matter, so it's very easy to manipulate people with this language. So people need to be armed and they need to understand some of the different concepts. I won't go into it in the podcast, but some of the different concepts I address in the book are things like hostile attribution bias, the Kafka trap, Mott and Bailey tactic, different manipulative tactics that these people use in order to manipulate people and in order to infuse this ideology.